The most common contractual mistakes, episode 8, not considering impacts of COVID 19. That is our topic for today. Welcome to the Lawyers and Mediators International Show and Podcast by InstantMediations.com, where we discuss law and conflict resolution topics to educate both professionals and everyday people. Catch regular episodes on YouTube, the Instant Mediations app, and anywhere you get your podcasts. Just remember, nothing in these episodes constitutes legal advice, so be sure to talk to a lawyer, as cases are fact dependent. Hi, everyone. This is Mac Pierre-Louis, attorney mediator and arbitrator working throughout Florida and Texas.
And Natalia advocate, mediator, and arbitrator from Warsaw, Poland.
And Federico Vasoli, Italian lawyer, managing partner of the MTV Global with offices in Singapore, Malta, and Vietnam.
Okay, so we're back with Federico, and this time we're talking more about a type of force majeure issue, and that is COVID 19. We all know it's changed everything in the world, mostly for the worse in many parts, but it's having a big impact on business and how business can be carried on around the planet. And so it would not be proper to not have Federico come and speak on this topic, since episode 7 was on force majeure or acts of God or acts of nature. We wanted him to discuss from his point of view, especially being from Italy, from his point of view, what he thinks are common contractual mistakes uh, in the business world when people don't consider the impacts of COVID 19. So, Federico, please, the floor is yours. Uh, can you start off with a little bit of the background of what's happening in Italy, because you guys have been in the news lately? So for me, I'm in the U.S., and I'm sure for Natalia, we'd like to kind of get a little perspective from you about what's happening in your country first.
Thank you, Mac. Well, let me give you a bit of background. First of all, legal background. That is, last time in episode 7, we discussed force majeure and how COVID-19 could or could not be regarded as an event of force majeure. Now that we are almost hitting 2 years of pandemic, perhaps we can somehow agree that to an extent COVID-19 should not be regarded now as an event of force majeure. What could be regarded as an event of force majeure is the government's actions that can be taken somehow randomly or suddenly to try and curb the pandemic and to try and hold on to a state of new normal that at least Europe and the West have reached so far. So again, about the background. The background is that, as you probably all know, Italy unfortunately was hit really hard by COVID-19. We experienced, 150,000 deaths related to it. So it was truly bad. Once we got hold of the vaccines, that gave us light. Now, another very important caveat, I do not live in Italy. I'm in Italy on my way back to Malta, but I lived through the pandemic in Asia, first in Singapore and then in Vietnam. So, of course, my vision is filtered not just by my prejudices, by my own experiences, but also by the fact that I was not physically present in Italy, although I talked to my parents, my sister, my friends, etc., on a regular basis. Now, you asked me about the current situation, Mac. The current situation is that Italy has been remarkably efficient in vaccinating, perhaps at the time of recording this video, more than 80% of the eligible population, not of the entire population, which is remarkable for a country of 60-something million people. Also, let me joke about it, let me crack a cheap pun, considering Italy's notorious inefficiency. So we've been really good at it. On the other hand, probably because we were hit so hard back in 2020, we are trying to implement severe rules so that everybody gets vaccinated, or at least has a so-called green pass, a certification that allows every individual in Italy, not necessarily citizens or residents, to access the business world, to access work. So starting from the 15th of from the 15th of October onwards, I was thinking about February last year when the pandemic hit hard, but starting on the 15th of October 2021, everybody has to have a so-called green pass, that is a certification attesting that he or she is either testing negative to COVID-19 or the past 48 hours maximum, or has been vaccinated within 6 months or 9 months, depending on the type of vaccine. Otherwise, that person will not be allowed, in most cases, to work. And this evidently has a huge impact on society at large and on the business community.
And this is what I would want you to expand on, because from this perspective, COVID and the measures taken by governments can have impact on contractual obligations on two fields. First of all, of what we write into the contracts, but also on the contractual performance. And I wanted you to expand on how, from what you see, those measures, the vaccination obligation, can impact the performance of contractual obligation of business men, of entrepreneurs, uh, under that, financially or in terms of speediness of their duties.
You used the word, Natalia, you said obligation. And the fact is that vaccines are not obligatory, they're not mandatory. That would, in a way, simplify things. If the government said, look, we're facing a pandemic of gigantic proportions, and the only solution that we have now is the vaccination campaign, hence, anyone who is fit to be vaccinated must be vaccinated, that would clear up the air more than implementing rules that de facto make life really difficult for those that are not vaccinated. But the legislator says, look, vaccinations are optional. It's a choice. You're free to choose whether to get vaccinated or not. Now, in a way, the counter argument is, yes, but you can still get a swab test. So get tested. If you test negative, you will be given a so-called green pass, a certification that says that you're negative, so you're not representing a danger for those around you. And you can work, you can go to your workplace, you can travel, you can do whatever it is allowed to do with a green pass. Problem is that the green pass's validity is limited to 48 hours. So every 48 hours, that is every second day if you go to work from Monday to Friday, as most people do, you need to get tested, say, on Sunday, then again on Wednesday, and then again Friday, if you want to be able to go to work. It is invasive and it is quite expensive. I don't know. I personally, just to be absolutely transparent, I'm personally vaccinated and I am pro-vax. But it is true that there are a lot of people that cannot be vaccinated and that they are simply expressing their freedom of choice not to get vaccinated, and they will need to encounter a decent expense every week or every month if they want to keep their job. Otherwise, the consequence of not getting vaccinated and not having the green pass is that you lose your job. In certain cases, you still nominally keep your job without pay. In certain others, you are simply fired. Now, there are some sectors, for instance, the health sector, to my knowledge, also certain fields like the army and other fields where you must be vaccinated. That was mandatory already back in early 2021 when vaccines were first available in Italy. But in most cases, no. So the financial consequences can be big. The labor consequences can also be big. Indeed, there can be an impact on the performance of contractual obligations, because if you don't have, let's assume that you're an employer, you're a business, and you have employees, people that work for you. If these people cannot show up at work because of these restrictions, then inevitably you will have some consequences on lead times, at least, on quality of your manufacturing, on quality of your services, and so on. So indeed, the consequences are pretty big. Constitutional, employment law related, and also towards third parties that rely on your workforce to perform contractual obligations. They're pretty big.
Yeah, and thank you for that big spectrum. When it comes to one end of the spectrum, and that is contractual obligations between the employer in that individual employee? How do you see things working out that way? Are there provisions or excuses that one party could use to protect themselves in a contract dispute? Because I can see that this is something that's going to disrupt a lot of agreements that nobody ever saw coming.
That's absolutely true. Let's put things into the right perspective, though. As I said in the beginning, about 80% of the population has been vaccinated. So the reality is that whilst each individual's rights are fundamental and protected by the Constitution, as well as by international conventions, it is still true that proportionally the impact that 20% of the population that is not vaccinated is limited. In Italy, we have experienced a few protests recently. I'm sure that you were referring to those before, that have been quite controversial, but reality is that did not disrupt the economy. There has been a pretty important protest in Trieste, which is a seaport, a relatively important seaport in Italy, even though it doesn't rank that high in the world ranking of seaports. We were fearing that supply chains would be completely disrupted by it because the workers at the seaport decided to, as I said, to protest. Reality is no, there were no disruptions whatsoever. There were, pundits will say that there was violence on one side or on the other side. I'm not getting into that. It's too political, too controversial. I don't even know the facts that well. What I know is that containers were unloaded, uploaded. There was no disruption whatsoever, really. So whether this is due to the police and the army doing their job, whether this is due to the protesters being reasonable and not being violent, that is not up to me to say. But we should put things into perspective. That is, it is a limited amount of the Italian population of the workforce that is not vaccinated, and it is protesting against the Green Pass. Mind you, they're not necessarily protesting against vaccinations. There are various streams. There are people who are protesting against vaccinations. Some others who are protesting against the Green Pass. So maybe they are vaccinated themselves, but what they don't want is to have to show a certificate in order for them to be allowed to work or go to the restaurant, fly, and so on. So it's the problem is not so big, and in fact, the government is keeping quiet these days over the matter because it's not so controversial after all in the grander scheme of things. Sorry for the long answer, but
No,
essentially
that's
there's not
actually
so much to
quite.
worry about.
No, that's quite important, but we can also look at COVID in a very broad perspective and some other things that it brought to us that really are of concern to many people. What we can see here, for example, in Poland, but I'm aware that it also happens in the States, is a huge increase of prices. So prices going up. And also people complain, and we can see that in Poland so well, about inflation, and it is related to COVID. Can you see the impact of that on inflation onto the contractual obligations, and especially whether you see the trend to insert any inflation clauses into the contracts?
Yes, I do see it. I see the impact in both Malta and Italy, so both European countries. And I do see a problem in contracts indeed, because many contracts have fixed prices. And especially with the rise in prices of raw materials and shipping costs, suppliers may not be able to stick to the agreed prices. So indeed, I see the problem. It's a very good point that you touched on, Natalia. Absolutely.
Go ahead, Natalia. You can continue.
Thank you. And I understand that not without giving legal advice, we just need to make the clients aware that the inflation can also be remedied in the contract when thinking about getting a contractual obligation, or when the need arises to amend the contract accordingly, so that there is a measurement to which the goods or the price can be evaluated, so that it keeps its value rather than losing it because of inflation. But due to that and all those broad spectrum of what COVID brought to us, to business, I also wanted to ask you if you see any interesting jurisprudence or tendency in arbitration so far, because is 2 years enough for particular trends to develop or at least start growing? What do you think?
Yes and no. Actually, no and yes. That is, I have not encountered, but it may just be me not having access to a broader range of sentences and judicial decisions. I've not experienced significant decisions in this direction. On the other hand, I have indeed witnessed contractual solutions, especially in the recent months, aimed at tackling these problems in advance. So, what I'm saying is, I haven't seen a court decision on inflation, on these disruptions that you mentioned, but I have seen contractual parties addressing these matters in advance in their contracts. And significantly, a couple of days ago, I was going through a contract where there is a um, two-tier clause on dispute resolution. That is, the considering the industry where these companies in which these companies work, they decide, which is the cosmetics industry that is heavily impacted by rising costs in shipping and raw materials, as well as the new trend on sustainability, because most of the cosmetic industry is plastic based. um, the parties decided to first address disputes by convening an informal arbitration, an informal mediation through the boards of directors of their respective companies. And then, if a solution cannot be found, they would go for arbitration in a specific court of arbitration. And if that does not solve the problem, then they will go to court in England. This is a case under English law. Quite interesting, especially the second part, where you have an arbitration center that already addresses the problem, and yet they have included the possibility for ordinary courts to step in. Pretty interesting.
Thank you for that. So we're wrapping up at this point, but can you, before we close, give a little bit of a comparison analysis between what you're seeing in Italy and what you've seen or what you are seeing happening in the other countries you've lived in, specifically in Vietnam, Singapore, where else you've worked? Can you do a little bit of contrast in comparison for us?
Singapore first. Singapore is always forward looking, or tries to be forward looking. So they try and solve problems beforehand. For instance, by introducing temporary measures, such as the measures that were already introduced in 2020 about the possibility of, I don't know, holding AGMs online and other provisions that essentially stepped in to help companies that didn't have these provisions in their articles of association, and the government helped them out. Same with incentives for the population that was hit by COVID, the industries that were most severely hit by the pandemic, and so on. Vietnam has somehow frozen over these months, starting from June, July. But now the situation is improving because they're vaccinating a large chunk of the population. So eventually they will go back to normal. I have not seen legal disruptions. I have seen, unfortunately, a lot of businesses not making it. They ceased operations. They decided not to go to Vietnam. They decided not to operate in that country anymore, etc. Italy, there is, from the few weeks that I have spent here, I have seen a lot of optimism. Probably boosted also by the recent sports victories in various fields, not just in football. Um, so there is optimism and there is the will to continue. Now, higher than it was before, but still on the brighter side of the spectrum. So all in all, it's a pretty good situation. Malta, so far so good. Malta is a very small country that has already vaccinated like 90% of the population, and already 5% of the population got the third shot, the booster shot. So it is on the right track. Malta has other problems to tackle now, normally, essentially the grey listing by the Financial Action Task Force, but that is probably the subject of another episode. So all in all, I have a relatively optimistic view. Singapore has managed it pretty well. Vietnam is going out of it. Italy is on the optimistic side of the spectrum, and Malta is doing pretty well.
And having said that, since we promised to do the business review in 20 minutes, we are closing up our topic of today, the most common contractual mistakes, episode 8, not considering impacts of COVID. And we hope that we managed to persuade everybody watching or listening that really considering impacts of COVID is vital for any contractual obligation, for drafting the contracts, and then for keeping up with the obligations that are already stipulated in the valid contract. Please stay with us for the next episodes.
Thanks.